Welcome, everyone. Personally, I do appreciate everyone that's attending today. I'd like to open our webinar by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. An important step in reconciliation is our acknowledgement of traditional land. I'm very pleased with the attendance today of our coalition members, our directors, academics. There are some community members and police practitioners. Thanks to all of you. Our discussion today will center on the challenges and relevance of police education and training in Canada. As all of you know, both the entry level and in-service training of our police officers varies from province to province. And in our opinion, education is not clearly focused on the competencies required of an operational police officer. Our mission is to see the creation of a national center of policing excellence, a center responsible for the research and preparation of curriculum content that is consistent, current, and relevant. This is necessary to prepare our police officers today for their important work in our complex and diverse 21st century. It is my hope that our time today together will contribute to this important discussion. Before I introduce our moderator today, I would ask that each of you mute your mics, and this is only to avoid any unnecessary background noise, and please remember to turn your mic on when you're ready to speak. We welcome questions in the chat. Please place them in the chat, and our moderator will draw from those questions, or he may decide to have a direct specific question to one of our three speakers, our three panelists. It is indeed now my pleasure to introduce and welcome Neil Dubord, a good former associate of mine from Edmonton, who will moderate today's session and introduce each of our panelists. Neil is an accomplished professional and author with over 37 years of experience in policing and public safety. Neil is the former police chief from Delta, chief of the Metro Vancouver Transit Police, and deputy chief from Edmonton. In addition to his national and international consulting work, he has delivered keynote presentations at many conferences, attended and presented at international committees, and published in prominent journals. Neil holds a doctorate in business management and a master's in leadership training. Neil, thank you very much for taking your time from your very, very busy schedule to be with us today, and I'll turn it over to you. Neil?
My pleasure, and thank you so much, David. I know that the Canadian Police Reform Association of Police Reform is doing some amazing work, and I look forward to, a great conversation this afternoon. So first of all, good afternoon, everyone, and I am Neil Dubord. I want to welcome you to what I hope will be somewhat of maybe an uncomfortable but yet necessary conversation that we might have. We often start these webinars with some pleasantries, but today I'm looking at the state of policing in 2026, and I think we need to start with the truth. And the truth is, the current model of police training in Canada is not working as well as it could. So let's start off. First, we must confront what we believe is the competence illusion. And Dave, you spoke a little bit about this. We have confused training with learning. In policing, we're obsessed with training. We tick the boxes. Can you shoot? Check. Can you drive? Check. Can you decide or recite the criminal code? Check. Do you know your authorities? Check. That is all mechanical training, but learning is different. Learning is about critical thinking, emotional intelligence, and understanding the why behind the what. Right now, we have a lot of highly trained officers who are, quite frankly, poorly educated on the complexities of the society we serve. We're teaching mechanics when we should be teaching mindset. I recognize that the coalition has been advocating for a national college of policing for some time, and that could help change the focus of how we handcuff to how we solve. Secondly, we want to look at the current operating like a postal code lottery. And what I mean by that is, I'll ask yourself this: why should a citizen in Surrey receive a different standard of policing than a citizen in Moose Jaw or a citizen in Halifax? Currently, we have a fragmented patchwork of standards. Every agency, every province does it slightly different. This inconsistency is dangerous. It creates liability, it erodes trust, and the patch we wear on our sleeve and the citizens in Toronto judge their police by the service and actions of the police in Vancouver, because that patch is all the same, or the citizens in Edmonton or the citizens in Calgary judge it by the other police services across the country. We need a central body that establishes a gold standard for the curriculum, a standard that doesn't change just because you crossed a municipal border. And third, my final point here is that perhaps the most controversial is the trade school fallacy. We love to call policing a profession. We compare ourselves to doctors and lawyers, but let's be honest, doctors and lawyers spend years in university before they ever touch a patient or a client. We take people from society, we put them through a 24 or 26-week vocational boot camp and send them out to manage the most complex social crises imaginable. It's an impossible task. You cannot compress sociology, psychology, and legal theory required for modern policing into 6 months. If we want to be a profession, we need to stop treating police education like a vocational trade and start treating it like a prerequisite for a professional practice. So the question today isn't, do we need better training? The question is, are we brave enough to dismantle the old model and build one that prioritizes education over instruction, consistency over fragmentation, and professionalism over vocationalism? So let's help tear this apart and look for solutions. And I'm joined by three incredible panelists who will view this from three very different lenses. Dr. Greg Brown, who was an operational cop for 28 years, and after his PhD is now consulting and brings the data and uncomfortable questions about our current inadequacy. Inspector Kelly Wong from the Surrey Police Service, who is the current officer in charge of professional skills section and in the trenches right now of the Surrey transition, dealing with the reality of the recruitment and retention that's required to build the police department from the ground up. And Professor Joseph Hayes, a professor of Carleton University with a law degree, who helps us understand the educational framework and critical theory that we're missing. So I'm going to start with Dr. Greg Brown, and I'm going to turn it over to you. But first, Greg, I want to be able to read a little bit of your bio. And Dr. Greg Brown is the president and lead consultant of Gregory Brown Consulting, a business he developed and launched in 2008. Greg brings to this position a particular unique and diverse background in academic, educational, and police criminal justice worlds. He is a Fulbright scholar and holds an undergraduate degrees in history and criminology, magna cum laude, and an honors bachelor's of social science with specialization in criminology from the University of Ottawa. Greg was awarded the Master of Arts, a thesis with distinction, and then a doctorate from the Carleton University of Canada. Greg worked in operational policing for 28 years with one of Canada's largest municipal police services and served on various joint forces and multi-jurisdictional investigative initiatives throughout Ontario and Quebec. So Greg, I'm going to turn it over to you and you can kick us off with a little bit of controversy.
Well, thank you very much, Chief of the Board. Yeah, that's an interesting way to start controversy. I'm sure I'll engender some. Usually when I speak at policing conferences these days, I get some raised eyebrows and then a lot of questions and then solicitations from potential clients. And just to be clear, I'm not looking for any new clients. The consulting business is very robust. And in the lead up to our presentation today, we were talking off camera about life-work balance and not being too busy. So my presentation here today is not soliciting new business. Things are very busy, and right when I think that things are winding down, one of the law firms that I do work with hits me with another consulting file, and that's going to inform a little bit about some of the controversy that I'm going to relate to today. I don't have extensive notes. I have an iPad here that I've pasted some stuff onto, but I generally try to do this sort of from the hip and respond to questions. And so I'm probably going to focus a fair bit on the area of consulting that I do a lot of work on now, sadly, and that relates to use of force. As Chief of the Board said, I think in the preamble to the webinar, none of us would disagree with the lead statement. You know, the policing landscape today has changed, shifted rapidly, shaped by community expectations, technology, and increased focus on wellness and accountability. I would consider myself to be an expert on three of those: community expectations, technology, and accountability. And I have the empirical studies in those areas to back up some of my opinions. I think my bias is fairly well articulated. I come from an operational policing background. Did about 9 years patrol work. I was a training officer for 13 young constable recruits. I went into drug work for 8 years, homicide investigation, including a very large internal investigation that was pretty uncomfortable, but We arrested some police officers. That was not great. And then I was transferred by my police department, the Ottawa Police Service, to the Criminal Intelligence Service Ontario, where I spent most of my career. So my bias is generally considered to be pro-police, which I'll get into in a couple of minutes. So the areas I'm probably going to focus on are use of force, because that's very controversial. That is a jackpot that a lot of police departments wind up in. I, as a consultant, of course, give an unbiased opinion on use of force transactions. The government of Alberta hired me to go out with to serve on a panel looking at Calgary Police Service with a retired Chief Justice out there. So this is a jackpot area for police services. One bad use of force transaction, public uprising, not to mention the civil lawsuits, the damage to the police credibility in that city or jurisdiction. So I'll probably focus a little bit on that. I know Chief DeBoard has some pre-made questions. I'm going to try to focus on use of force and dovetailing into that scenario training, which is one of the other items. I don't think we can have enough scenario training. In my own experience, and I'm sure that the Chief of Ottawa Police would not disagree or have an issue with me sharing this, training for frontline officers, the ones where the rubber hits the road and where the use of force transactions are more than likely, probably amounts to 8 hours a year over 2 days. There's a lot of time taken up with modules on a computer and so on and so forth, but doing the provincial requal takes time on the firearms part. But the actual judgment training under high stress in real world situations, this might be a controversial statement, but in my understanding across Canada, this is sorely lacking. When we have an officer out there that is not properly trained, that can't make the proper judgment calls under duress in high stress situations, it is where police services boards wind up paying millions of dollars in settlements, and officers' careers are destroyed. And I think that's a really, really big problem. I'll probably get into that a little bit more, but I wanted to address one particularly relevant issue, which is my positioning where I work at Carleton University, and I'm a professor there. I teach in the Law Legal Studies department. I also teach in the Sociology and Anthropology department. My postdoc is from York University Osgoode Hall Law School, so tend to do a lot more in the law field than criminology. But interesting, I have never taught a course in the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Carleton. And the reason for that is because I believe I'm the only non-critical criminologist in the entire university. I might be the only one in the entire province of Ontario. I'm not sure. I know my co-panelist, Instructor Hayes, is a critical criminologist. I'm not surprised. But when you attend meetings of the American Society of Criminology, you learn that a minute fraction, less than 1% of criminologists internationally are critical criminologists, but our universities tend to focus on critical criminology. To the extent that I have on my iPad here, currently there's a petition, it's still in existence. We have 1,286 scholars and lawyers calling on the federal, provincial, and municipal governments to defund police services. Most of the people I work with in the university context are signatories to this petition. It's important, I think, to understand the environment in terms of understanding where we can deliver a better policing education program. In a critical criminology university, I don't think you have the expertise there to teach frontline officers what they need to know about contemporary policing. And that might be a little bit controversial, but I can think of a lot of my colleagues who do not, I'll just be blunt, they do not like the police. They do not like police officers. They do not like the institution of policing. When I was doing my graduate studies at Carleton, I heard whispers from people, faculty members, oh, there goes the armed agent of the state. And of course, with the George Floyd episode and the acrimony that resulted from that, the reputation of police on campuses was even further destroyed, to the point where we have many professors, as I said, 1,286 people signing a petition with some pretty inflammatory, is my characteristic, language. And it's worth quoting, I think. Police have very limited capability to prevent crime and regularly, this is the word, regularly criminalize large swaths of those they are directed to serve and protect. It's a pretty sweeping statement. Regularly criminalize large swaths. We reject the tired, inaccurate notion that when police interventions go wrong, it is because of one bad person. Instead, we point to the structure and culture of policing that is rooted in power and state-sanctioned violence. Defunding the police is directly related to divestment from criminal law and prisons as a means of addressing social problems. I don't think people that have that mindset can teach today's frontline police officers. Their bias, in my opinion, is just far too strong. If you think a fundamental ethos of your being is defund the police and close all the prisons, I don't think you can teach police officers and prison guards or correctional workers how to do their job better. You fundamentally disagree with their existence. I don't know how you can then instruct them how to be better police officers and do the job that policing does, of course, which involves using force, taking away people's rights, deprivation of liberty, confrontational circumstances. We all know this, that come from the world of policing. You know, police show up on people's worst days. That's just the way this works. My colleague, Professor Haggerty, Kevin Haggerty, University of Alberta, very established criminologist in Canada, backs up my opinion. So it's not just myself, but Professor Haggerty wrote a response to the decision by my university to ban police from campus, to completely eliminate any kind of cooperative programs between the university and police departments, criminal justice agencies. And he really disagrees with that. And I'll just read briefly from his thoughts here. Recently, my friends and colleagues at the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Carleton University introduced a new series of initiatives. One particularly worrying development, however, has generated considerable attention. Their decision to eliminate the opportunity for undergraduate students to do placements with either police or correctional organizations. Such placements have been part of criminology programs in Canada for decades. And then he concludes by saying, I'll just skip to the bottom, Carleton's decision amounts to a type of extreme institutional isolationism based on their stated claim that policing and corrections are impervious to reform. Such resigned pessimism is at odds with a long list of developments. So a couple of things in my introductory remarks. I hope I haven't gone over time. Use of force, officers need much more of it. Much more. In my role as a police services board member for the OPP, I was looking to establish a pilot project where all our officers in the detachment areas covered by my jurisdiction would be compensated for gym memberships, time off, elevated levels of martial arts training, ground fighting techniques and stuff. Because when we have an untrained officer get into a physical confrontation, bad things happen. Highly trained officers maintain their composure. They use the minimum amount of force. Doesn't matter how many video cameras are recording it. People will watch it and say, wow, yeah, that perpetrator got his ass kicked. Use that language. But the officer did everything professionally. That was a very professional application of force. It wasn't because of a temper or getting upset. The officer did what he had to do, controlled the situation. The use of force transaction was brief. And that's, I think, where we have to go on top of additional, much more additional high stress, realistic scenario training. It's a whole bunch of, I could go on for hours talking about that because I have just done some consulting on that particular point. But officers have to be under stress and it has to be realistic. We can't baby officers. You know, I remember doing my use of force, just apply 5% force. You don't learn anything doing 5% force. And so there's considerations. I'm sure the inspector might be conscious of that in her portfolio. Workplace injuries. I mean, when you're training use of force at 100%, people's wrists get broken, people get broken noses, things happen. But to do less than that is a disservice to our officers, which I think is one of the themes that we're looking at here. The second point that I made was who's going to deliver the new police curriculum. Clearly, as I agree with Chief DeBoard, the current system does not work. It's really not good. I was shocked when you said 6 months. In Ontario, of course, they've added the fourth cohort. One of our sons just went through the program in the last 2 years. It's about 12 weeks, to be honest. There's a little bit of online stuff and a little bit of, in-service training, depending on which service you come from. But they're down to about 12 weeks because of the push. I mean, we need more officers, grind them out, get them through, get their signature on a piece of paper, and let's get moving. So we got a lot of work to do. I admire the organization, and I thank you for the invitation. I hope I wasn't too controversial, but I think I'll leave it for now and probably address some questions, but I'll leave some time for my co-panelists.
Thanks a ton, Gregory. I sure appreciate your input here as well. And I want to open it up to questions before we go to our next panelist, which will be Inspector Kelly Wong. So I see a question here from David Herman. When you say more use of force, question just disappeared on me. I'm going to go up there and grab it. When you say more use of force, do you include more de-escalation training?
Yeah, I would go across the whole spectrum of use of force. Just going back to the basics, it's so interesting. I did an interview, a podcast across the United States last week in relation to the shooting in Minneapolis. And, right from the outset, and I asked our son this when he went through the training, if you look at the Minneapolis video, get out of the car, do this. I didn't hear the word arrest. You're under arrest. If somebody shows up at my house and starts yelling at me to get out of the car and get on the ground, I need to understand what's going on here. So it goes all the way from the fundamental basics of, and I told our son and other young officers that I know, the first thing's out of your mouth if you're going to be using force or taking away somebody's liberty or putting them in some kind of restraints. It's very important legally as well as morally or socially. You're under arrest. I'm a police officer. I'm telling you to get out of the car. If you don't obey me, that's a criminal offense. It's got to be very clear. And of course, then that spans all the way to lethal force. Everything in between, Chief DeBoard. It needs full and comprehensive training, right from the fundamentals right through to proficiency. And, I've worked with officers that can't fight their way out of a paper bag. I mean, it's embarrassing to watch you, and I see people smiling and laughing. It's embarrassing to see somebody on the annual training hitting the heavy bag with their asp. It looks like a fly swatter, and you're like, can't you hit harder than that? I mean, if you hit a real bad guy like that, he's going to turn that thing around and give you a good solid whooping. So much more proficiency. And where I see the trend in the lawsuits that I work on is officers that are untrained or poorly trained, are not in good physical condition, have no understanding of techniques. And they wind up using force in an unreasonable way that costs, sadly, in some cases, people's lives or injuries, and certainly millions of dollars in lawsuits. So if part of your job involves use of force, you should know how to use force, I guess is the simple way of putting it. That includes everything. Don't use force when de-escalation will work. But when you're actually putting hands on, be competent and know what you're doing and have a good outcome as opposed to a bad outcome.
If the universities aren't friendly to policing, which obviously Carleton certainly fits into that mix, where do you go for that level of training? Where do you go for, education, I guess it is. Where do you go for that level of education if the universities aren't the place?
I think that probably policing is a provincial responsibility other than the RCMP. I think provincial or regional police training universities is probably the way to go, integrated with the community colleges and the Ontario Police College. But I mean, it's ironic we're talking about this. In 2019 and a couple of years previous, myself and Professor George Ragakos, who's a professor of law at Carleton, also a signatory to the petition, which is strange. George must have had a change of heart over the last year. But we were engaged in meetings sanctioned by our university, Carleton, with Algonquin College, and we were going to try to institute, before anybody else thought of it, a Bachelor of Police Sciences degree program at Carleton, a 4-year degree program that would involve all the kind of training we would want officers to have, whether it be practical, hands-on type stuff through a community college sort of setting, and then some of the liberal arts university stuff. And of course, that is completely off the table now. But so I think maybe going through a established university might not be feasible, just in terms of having qualified people to teach. I think that might be a problem. As I experienced on my PhD defense, if somebody has a visceral hatred of a police officer, it's pretty hard for them to teach you or to be objective sort of in their assessment. So I would probably think, just on the fly, provincial or regional police programs dedicated to the profession of policing, just like nursing or chiropractic or many other professions that we're aware of. You might have the Prairies Police Institute that awards a 4-year degree program. It would be an excellent program. Maybe you have one in Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes out west. That would probably be the best way to facilitate it. I don't know if that removes altogether the Ontario Police College, for example. That would probably be the best way to do it. Combine everything into one place. Officers walk out, or potential officers walk out with a 4-year degree in policing sciences. They're ready to go right away out of the gate.
Great, good, thank you. And I just want to mention one more comment, and then I'll go right over to Inspector Wong. There was a comment from Nancy McNaughton, and Craig Bunnell did a great presentation at the Evidence-Based Policing Conference on this, based on his assumptions of students in his classes about these critical perspectives. Greg, based on his unverified beliefs about police, finding it is prevalent, certainly is. Yeah, so I thought it was worthwhile mentioning, and if anybody wants that, they can probably find that view in that presentation. So let me go on to Inspector Kelly Wong, who is the officer in charge of the professional skills section with the Surrey Police Service in British Columbia. She leads the service-wide training and professional development in one of Canada's fastest growing police services, with responsibility for recruit and exempt onboarding, advanced training, leadership development, and training and governance. Through this work, SPS continues to develop educational programming that supports ongoing learning and professional achievements and career-long development for staff at all levels. Kelly works at the intersection of education, workforce growth, and the organizational sustainability, focusing on how training systems, clear standards, and best practices, and the effective use of technology can support operational readiness, member development, and long-term retention. She holds a Master's of Leadership from Royal Roads University and brings practical evidence-informed perspective to national discussions on future of police education. And thank you so much for all the hard work that goes on with the Surrey Police Service. I know that many of your members have worked for many years to try and bring that to fruition, and it's coming along. It's going to get there, and I think we're all optimistic on the final goal. So thank you for being here, Kelly.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. Boy, Greg, you made this really hard to follow up after you did a great job with your presentation there. And I'm going to be fully transparent. I do have a script that I'm going to follow, and because if I don't, after doing this work for almost 5 years, everything starts to get mixed together, and I worry that if I'm trying to explain something, I will start to ramble and it won't make sense. So apologies, but I am going to follow a script just to make sure that my message here is very clear and helpful to this discussion that we're having today. Thank you again. The Coalition for Canadian Policing Excellence is bringing people together to think about how we can strengthen policing in Canada. And what I'm going to talk about fits into that space, but it's not as a model to replicate. It's a case study, and it looks at what happens when training has to be built inside operational uncertainty rather than after the fact, and what role training can end up playing as a retention strategy when an organization is being stood up. And so this is my firsthand account of how training at Surrey Police Service evolved over time and how it functioned, and sometimes intentionally, sometimes out of necessity, but it was a stabilizing force during a complex policing transition that we are actually still very much involved in. For those who might not know, we do still have our CP that are providing policing support in 2 of our 5 districts still in the city. I'm not going to be walking through every decision point or variable. I can't get into the weeds because, frankly, I just don't have the time. And those details will overwhelm the bigger picture of what I'm trying to share here. So I'm going to stay very high level, and I'm just going to focus on what this experience that we've had at SPS might offer to the broader conversation being held here. So for context, and for those who aren't familiar with the origin story of Surrey Police Service, I'm going to provide a little bit more background here. We are a relatively new municipal police service in British Columbia, Canada. And before SPS existed, the city of Surrey was policed by the RCMP. And at that time, Surrey was the largest municipal RCMP detachment in Canada, with nearly 850 officers assigned to the city. So that just helps to show the scale and scope of what this transition has to do. The RCMP was providing contracted municipal policing, even though its core mandate in Canada is federal policing. So Surrey wasn't transitioning from one municipal service to another. It was moving from a federal policing model that had been adapted to meet municipal needs. And in November of 2020, the inaugural Surrey Police Board hired our very first Chief Constable, Norm Lipinski. And that was the moment when the formal beginning of SPS took place. And so from the very beginning, the existence of SPS generated strong and very public debate. So some saw that municipal police service was essential to Surrey's long-term needs, but others openly resisted it from political, policing, business, and community perspectives. And this was played out on the national stage. My parents in Ontario would call concerned about my employment with SPS because of what was being presented in the news there. So just to give you that context, because that environment mattered operationally to SPS. It influenced how experienced officers across Canada viewed the organization. It affected our recruitment and retention, and it shaped how much uncertainty our employees were asked to carry. And I'll acknowledge that it's on both sides. It was both in SPS and the RCMP workplace while we are still showing up to do the work. So at the same time, SPS was not merging two police services. We weren't inheriting mature systems or infrastructure. And the RCMP were still responsible for delivering the day-to-day policing in the early phase of the transition, which meant SPS had to be built while this was still happening live with the delivery of policing. So we had public uncertainty, we had no inherited infrastructure, and live operational delivery. And that was the backdrop for all of the training decisions that followed. So with that out of the way, I joined Surrey Police Service in April of 2021 after doing 21 years of policing with the Abbotsford Police Department. When I joined SPS, there was nothing. We had nothing. And so I was asked at that point to create a training framework. And the initial request was to build a program that would allow SPS to deploy experienced officers to the front line. And so one of the first decisions that I made was to reset training to zero for every experienced officer that was joining SPS. And it wasn't convenient for us to do that, but it was necessary because there is no shared national language in policing when it comes to training. Course titles vary, content varies, assessment standards vary. And over the past 5 years, SPS has hired experienced officers from 28 different police organizations across Canada. And we would ask these officers to provide us with the training records from their prior agency, but we couldn't rely on the information that it's provided. We couldn't verify the compliance with CC. And we didn't have the capacity or the risk tolerance as an organization to be able to interpret the equivalencies on those training records and still be able to defend them to the BC provincial policing standards. And so I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but we do have provincial policing standards that dictate how we train and deploy our officers to the front line. And I know that doesn't exist for all the provinces in Canada, but we do. And so we needed to establish a known baseline at SPS that met those provincial requirements, but also aligned with the RCMP operational expectations because we were deploying our officers into the RCMP workplace, but also had to train them on emerging SPS policies and processes that were still being developed in real time. So it was a bit of a balancing act to try to meet those requirements that were constantly changing. And the pressure was clear. We needed to be able to deploy our officers quickly. And it was, again, in a constantly shifting environment. So at that stage in SPS's existence, really training functioned less as professional development and more as risk management. And then as hiring accelerated later in 2021, SPS officers deployed under a secondment model inside an RCMP policing environment. And to support that, the training team developed a formal experienced officer onboarding program. And Greg, you'd mentioned lack of use of force training. Most organizations do 8 hours a year. In Surrey, in our onboarding program, our experienced officers are put through 6 weeks of onboarding, 4 weeks of which involve the use of force training, and it's a progression to start with the basics, and then they build and build and build. So that program, the experienced officer onboarding, became the primary pathway for SPS to deploy officers safely and consistently. And we established a cadence of 6 onboarding classes per year, and that cadence still exists today. But the challenge was the class sizes were unpredictable. Some cohorts, the very first one had 50 officers, and then as we started to struggle in the public environment with recruitment, other classes had 10. So every fluctuation of our classes required constant revisions of schedules, instructors, and then had bigger impacts downstream. And so it was evident quite early on that our training had to be scalable because demand was never predictable. And then as those early cohorts were deployed, more gaps surfaced and decisions changed quickly, often in response to operational realities because they only were visible once officers were on the ground. And training basically became the shock absorber for the organization. So we had to adapt our content, the timing and delivery in response to decisions that were made outside of our control, but they impacted us. And so that was, again, another reinforced point that training doesn't operate in isolation. In Surrey, it was very interconnected with our staffing models, the deployment decisions, and organizational risk. And then by May of 2022, SPS had hired 235 experienced officers. And in that time, we also sent our very first recruit class of 14 new recruits to the Justice Institute of British Columbia Police Academy. And so with that, it brought an entirely new training responsibility that we had to design from scratch. And so one sergeant was assigned to design and implement the initial recruit training model, but there's no playbook for this. We had to make it up as we went because we were deploying our recruits from a municipal police training program into an RCMP operational environment during their block 2, their practicum phase. And that had never been done before. So we had to move quickly, and our executive leadership had to negotiate agreements on very short timelines while we adjusted our training content and delivery under real constraints. Because ultimately, recruiting through the stream wasn't optional. It was foundational. And the future of SPS depended on our ability to grow through the new recruits alongside of the experienced officers, just to keep pace with what the organization needed to become. And so early recruit experience then quickly revealed to us that the police academy training alone wasn't enough to prepare our recruits for operational realities in Surrey. And as a response, we then developed additional training that we delivered before, during, and after the academy program. So that training was essential not only for readiness, but for their long-term retention. And by the end of 2022, we were running 2 major training pipelines simultaneously, 6 experienced officer classes and 3 recruit classes. Each had fixed timelines, fluctuating in size, and each competing for the same limited instructors, the administrative support, and training space. And let me tell you, standing up an organization in the middle of a pandemic, a global pandemic, was tough with no training space. So, sorry, I'm getting into some weeds there, but I'm just trying to give you a real appreciation for the challenges that we faced here. All of these changes or all of these stressors all of these factors placed real strain on the people that were building the organization while still keeping it operational. And that strain was compounded by national recruitment challenges and the continued uncertainty about SPS's future. And I don't know if anyone recalls, but we were working under the very public debate where our existence, we didn't know if we we're going to have a job in a few years. So in addition, at the same time, none of the enterprise systems that normally support training existed. So there was no HR system, there was no scheduling platform, there was no training data infrastructure. We had to create it all. And so the training staff, through virtue of their placement, they were the ones that identified the problem, that built the internal solutions, and then had to maintain them continuously because there was no one else here to do that work. And so as a result, training became the administration, the coordination, the data management, and governance layered on top of the development and delivery of our training. So as retention pressures emerged, training had to evolve again. So it became one of the most tangible ways that SPS could signal stability and investment in people was through our training. And by the end of 2023, SPS had hired 350 sworn officers. And during that time, the training team had built a 3-year foundational training progression for recruits to complete after the police academy. Year 1 courses were rolled out first, with years 2 and year 3 is coming up. And this was on top of our existing responsibilities, which added real volume year after year. And in the development of that training, we really relied on external contractors and consultants and subject matter experts because we just didn't have the capacity internally to be able to meet all of the demands that we were faced with. And so partnership and collaboration were key to our success and our existence. Around the same time, we also introduced increment training, which is 4 additional mandatory training events for all sworn members, again, increasing the organizational training demand. As well, specialty roles and promotional opportunities were expanded internally. And so training became central to their readiness and not something that was done after people stepped into their new roles, but something that prepared them beforehand. And so in 2023, legislative changes formally confirmed SPS as the police service for Surrey. And that mattered because it helped to reduce the organizational anxiety, and it finally created space to think beyond survival mode. But even with that certainty, demand for training continued to grow without corresponding growth in training resources. But if I had a very small team that was managing all this work, and it was incredible, but the only way that my team sustained that pace was by rethinking how we worked. And we built a lot of automation into our workflows just to keep things moving. But honestly, that is a story for another day. And I won't go into the weeds of that. But just for your awareness, we had to come up with innovative ways to manage the workload with a very small team. And so when SPS became police of jurisdiction in November of 2024, operational pressure increased immediately. And overnight, literally, not figuratively, literally overnight, SPS inherited on their payroll, on their staff, over 400 civilian staff that had been supporting in the RCMP environment, and they transitioned into SPS employees. So onboarding that many employees at once was beyond my team's capacity to onboard them. So responsibility for civilian onboarding rested with the individual teams across the organization that was inheriting those specific positions. And by the end of 2024, SPS had hired 410 sworn officers. So in 2025, training demand continued to expand. A 12-week pre-recruit employment program was introduced to secure applicants early and improve academy success. Sworn supervisor training expanded to include mandatory in-person administrative and operational courses that were tied to promotion. So these were mandatory training programs that we had to run. It wasn't a nice to have, it was a need to have. And so training at SPS was never just about curriculum or delivery. It was constant problem solving in an environment where demand consistently outpaced capacity. And so today, In less than 5 years, SPS has hired, trained, and deployed 620 police officers and employs more than 400 civilian staff. And our training team supports them across every phase of their career while the organization continues to grow. And to complete the policing transition in theory, SPS still needs to hire hundreds of more officers. So in closing, I just want to share a few lessons from the SPS experience to help inform this dialogue as it goes on. First, context matters. Training and retention decisions only make sense when you understand the conditions that an organization is operating under. And at SPS, training was built during public uncertainty without inherited systems and while policing was still being delivered by another agency. And those conditions shaped every decision that we made. Second, training is how organizations make opportunities real. So at SPS, training was one of the few things that we could make structured and predictable and visible when very little else felt certain. And that visibility gave people something solid to plan around, and that mattered. And third, as I mentioned before, external providers are essential. Much of what SPS built would not have been possible without external partners who allowed us to scale, maintain quality, and continue developing training under sustained pressure. And finally, I'll say this, in a large-scale startup policing organization where very little felt stable, training became the one thing that we could make predictable, and that predictability built trust. And in my experience, that's what makes people stay. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Chief of the Board.
Great. Thank you so much, Inspector. And, just a couple of quick comments from the chat here. Accommodations to the leadership team at SPS. SPS is lucky to have you. You could write a book, so there's lots there. So congratulations on that. There are a couple of questions, but Gregory, I'm going to turn it over to you just to sort of clarify your training, first of all, what you meant by your 8 hours mandatory training.
Yeah, thank you, Chief. Yeah, maybe I misspoke, but when Inspector Wong was talking about the training that they did with onboarded officers, I think that's the equivalent to the kind of training in Ontario, at least officers get at the Ontario Police College, which is very robust. It's A to Z, and there's a lot of it. What I'm talking about there is the annual use of force qualifications. And I know in my experience at a large police service, Ottawa in Ontario, I'm sure it would be the same from my understanding, Toronto, Hamilton, all the other ones. We were required to go for 2 days of training. Some of that would be CPR, first aid, modules on Indigenous issues or racial issues. The actual hands-on use of force, encompassing all aspects of use of force, if you stopwatched it, I think it would be less than 8 hours. And I use the golf analogy. I'm a golfer. I'm a 8 handicap. I'm a decent golfer. If I don't practice for 2 weeks, guess how I score? And, when I'm retained on consulting files or police services that want some information about training regimens, it's just not satisfactory for an officer in a high stress. I had several of them in my career, life and death, high stress situations. To expect somebody to perform at 100% capability under high stress in a life and death situation with that little amount of training, of course, we wind up with problems and lawsuits and tragedies. I mean, I can go on and on. I get frustrated. I get animated about this because I ran a platoon of officers and I wanted them to be great at what they did. So we did extra training in the gym, because I didn't want them being the ones getting in the jackpots and knowing what they're doing. So it's a passionate thing for me. I hate to see headlines, officers charged by SIU, well, maybe they did something wrong, but the training, if you dig down, might have been insufficient. And so that's all I'd like to say about that. Great presentation, Kelly. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much.
And if you're looking at hiring 200 people, are you trying to lure Neil and I out of retirement or something?
Come on over.
Send the corporate jet down to Clearwater Beach and we can maybe talk about the terms. I'm available.
Just a quick comment. I think Dr. John Lilly mentioned if we need more doctors, we don't shorten the training. You recruit from afar to fill the gap, right? And so true. Often in policing, right, we adjust our training to be able to meet the needs. So there's some sort of messaging in there that we can talk about at the roundtable after. But I don't want to delay on getting on to Professor Joseph Hayes, who holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in law with concentration in criminology and criminal justice from Carleton University, and a Master's in Education from Trent University, where his master's research examined diversity, equity, and inclusion education at the Peterborough Police Department, or Police Service, I guess I should say. I don't know why departments in British Columbia are always departments rather than police services, but maybe someday we'll change that. And Surrey is certainly heading down that path. A former Ontario Provincial Police Constable and Detective, Professor Hayes has taught in the Police Foundations program at Fleming College and Trent University since 2006, delivering courses such as police powers, criminology, and diversity in policing. And Dr. Hayes, I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation. Thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you so much, Neil. I should make a couple of, if I could, gentle corrections. I'm not a doctor, although I play one on TV, but I'm not a doctor. And I am a proud graduate of Carleton University. I don't teach at Carleton, I teach at Fleming. Gregory, I'm disappointed to hear, and I sort of read and heard this before about Carleton's take on police. And I'm a proud graduate of Carleton. I actually had my field placement with Nepean Police. It was a highlight of my, one of the highlights of my university career. So, like Kelly, I'm going to read from a script. I'm not a great off-the-cuff speaker, as Gregory demonstrated here. So I'm going to do that. I hope I'm not offending anybody or I'm going to lose anybody's attention, but it's just where I feel most comfortable. So I'll just bring it up here. So firstly, let me begin by saying that it's an honor and a privilege to be here today and among such an esteemed group of speakers. I'd like to thank Jason Fenno for inviting me and not giving up on finding a guest speaker after the first 8 people he asked said they were too busy. So thank you, Jason. I should also state that the views and opinions expressed here today are my own and don't necessarily reflect those of my employer. By way of introduction and to give some context to my talk today, it's worth mentioning that I was once a police officer with the OPP. I started my career in 1995 at a small detachment in Coviconk. So there you go, detachment, we can use that word appropriately here. After 11 years, I left the OPP and started a career in education, becoming a full-time faculty member in the Police Foundations program at Fleming College. It's located in Peterborough. This is my 20th year at the college. In 2019, I returned to school at the age of, to start a Master of Education program at Trent University. It was around then that I read an article in our local paper. At the time, I could not have imagined the profound impact this story would have on my experience as a Trent student in shaping my worldview and my conceptualization of police, and even how and what I teach as a professor at Fleming College. The story was about a 2019 Trent University undergraduate study examining how representative the Peterborough Police Service was of the community it served. This article would later become the catalyst for my graduate research. In the study, a semi-structured survey was administered to PPS uniform members, with 122 of the 208 members responding. One of the survey questions asked whether respondents identified as A, members of the LGBTQ2+ community, B, allies, or C, preferred not to answer. 3% identified as LGBTQ2+, 13% as allies, and 83% preferred not to respond. The 13 who identified as allies represented just 16 of the 122 participating members. I imagined what the community reaction might have been if 13% of members said that they were allies of the Black or Indigenous community, and 83% said they preferred not to respond. As someone born and raised in Peterborough, a former police officer, and a father of a son who identifies as gay, I was deeply troubled by this survey result. As noted earlier, I was just about to start my graduate studies. Early on in this process, I enrolled in the thesis stream, which necessitated a research project towards the end of my graduate studies. My thought was that I could use this opportunity to explore what might be at the root of the participants' response to the aforementioned survey question, and the role that education could play in addressing what, at least on the surface, appeared to be a form of bias on the part of some PPS members. Before describing my research, I need to digress slightly. From the beginning of my graduate studies, I was introduced to critical theory and critical pedagogy. In fact, many of my courses were framed around a critical or radical perspective, which probably won't surprise Gregory from what he had said earlier. My professors' teaching style and shared views, assigned course readings, and classroom discussions that examined critical theories and alike resonated deeply with me, affirming many of my beliefs, experiences, and personal observations over my lifetime. In a way, my introduction to critical pedagogy put a name on what I always suspected was true about unseen systems controlling much of our lives. At the risk of insulting anyone's intelligence here, because I know I'm among some incredibly bright and intelligent and well-educated people, I'd like to spend a brief moment to describe critical pedagogy. If you're not familiar with the term, please do not feel bad. I certainly was not, although, as I said, I always felt it at some level. So critical pedagogy seeks to expose the social, political, economic, and cultural systems that sustain institutional power and disadvantage marginalized communities. It argues that traditional education, often described as a banking model, obscures these power relations by presenting knowledge as neutral and uncontested. Ironically, critical pedagogy also holds the education can also serve as the great emancipator, serving as a site for developing critical consciousness. Through this process, learners are encouraged to question dominant narratives, recognize structures of oppression, and engage in action aimed at transforming institutions in pursuit of more just, equitable, and inclusive society. And so it was that critical pedagogy inspired my research and the theoretical framework I used to inform and guide me in my thesis project. In 2022, I published my research findings in a thesis that was entitled From Cultural Barriers to Educational Breakthroughs, Application of Critical Pedagogy to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Education at Peterborough Police Service. And that's available at all major bookstores. This paper examined the use of critical pedagogy as an approach to DEI education at Peterborough Police Service. It identified cultural barriers in policing, including hypermasculinity and isolationism, and drew on focus group findings to assess past DEI training experiences and future needs. The study argued that critical pedagogy, a theoretical framework and pedagogical approach, could help police critically examine power, systemic racism, and colonialism, and their own role in the maintenance of the status quo, leading to greater critical awareness and ultimately enhanced service delivery to marginalized communities. I should add that without the cooperation and support of Peterborough Police Service, none of this would have been possible. Applying a radical theory such as critical pedagogy to DEI education within policing is itself a radical act. In effect, this approach holds a mirror up to an institution whose historical function has often included the protection of dominant and elitist interests, sometimes at the expense of society's most vulnerable populations. Asking such an institution to pull back the veil and critically examine its own power, practices, and assumptions is no small undertaking, particularly given the entrenched cultural norms and institutional barriers that resist meaningful self-reflection and change. At this point, you may be asking, how does DEI education grounded in critical theory translate into enhanced service delivery, especially to marginalized communities? I believe it does so in three ways. First, systems of racism and discrimination embedded in our social institutions must be made visible. Until we recognize how these systems shape beliefs, behaviors, and decision-making, they cannot they cannot be meaningfully addressed, and institutional reform remains superficial. Second, critical DEI education reframes traditional ways of thinking that places blame on an individual's character, personality, or makeup. Instead, it directs attention to systems that create social, economic, and political conditions that produce crime and disorder. This perspective aligns directly with problem-oriented policing, which recognizes that unless root causes are identified and addressed, crime and disorder, merely the symptoms of deeper societal problems, will persist. Third, critical DI education creates space for individual officers to reflect on their own beliefs, assumptions, and both implicit and explicit biases. When this reflection occurs, behavioral changes become possible. At the micro level, that is the street level, it is only by shifting an officer's mindset away from purely dispositional thinking, where blame is placed on perceived deficiencies, and towards an undertaking of the broader systems of dominance that shape people's lives, that greater understanding can be fostered. In turn, this shift can promote empathy and compassion, replacing reflexive judgment and rejection with more informed, humane, and effective police responses. As you've likely gathered by now, my graduate studies at Trent was life-changing. Indeed, transformative education, that is, education that changes one perspective on the world and their place in it, and the kind I experienced at Trent is what I attempt to bring to the Police Foundations program and to our students at Fleming. Because for me, there's a significant distinction between training and education. At its core, training involves rote memorization of facts and honing of physical skills through repetition. In contrast, education inspires and challenges learners, engaging them to question their own reality. O'Sullivan writes, and I quote, "Transformative learning involves experiencing a deep structural shift in the basic premise of thought, feelings, and actions. It is a shift of consciousness that dramatically and irreversibly alters our way of being in the world. Such a shift involves understanding ourselves, our self-locations, our relationships with other humans, and with the natural world. Our understanding of relations of power and interlocking structures of class, race, and gender, our body awareness, our vision of alternative approaches to living, and our sense of possibilities for social justice and peace and personal joy." At the completion of my graduate studies, I returned to Fleming, inspired to put into practice many of the lessons I learned. Perhaps I should have mentioned before now that much of what I described thus far took place in the wake of the George Floyd murder. You may recall that this period was widely described as an inflection point in our society more broadly, but more specifically in policing, although we could probably argue whether much has changed. Yet, for perhaps the first time in memory, institutions, including policing, were forced to confront their role in sustaining societal hegemony and how their practices contributed to the marginalization of certain communities. We saw politicians and police chiefs across Canada take a knee to recognize systemic racism in policing and nearly universal acknowledgement that policing had to change. In 2022, at the encouragement of our chair, and with the help of fellow faculty and input from key stakeholders, I put forward a document that outlined recommended changes to the program that reflected my graduate studies and what was happening in society and the call for police reform. These recommendations were intended to produce several key outcomes, including reflect changes in society and policing in the wake of the George Floyd murder and other incidents involving police use of excessive force against racialized and minoritized people, expand student knowledge of Indigenous history, culture, and the relationship with police, enhance the student learning experience through scenario-based training, which, Grigor, I'm sure you're happy to hear that recommendation or outcome. Support student mental and physical health and well-being, and develop essential competencies like communication and problem solving. I want to be mindful of time here, but before I conclude, I would like to briefly discuss what we've done in practice, because it's one thing to talk about aspirational outcomes, and it's another to change how future officers are actually educated. To begin, our program acknowledges the important training that takes place at the Ontario Police College, where hard police skills like driving, defensive tactics, and use of force options are taught and reinforced by experts. That reality gives us the space to focus on developing soft skills such as communication, de-escalation, situational awareness, empathy, personal reflection, and of course, critical thinking. As discussed, it also allows us to explore critical frameworks that examine our institutions, roots of crime and disorder, social issues, and the role of police in society in a much different light. Topics once considered taboo in police, and I use quotations here, training, such as systemic racism and discrimination, the historical role of police in residential schools, the enforcement of laws that targeted gay men, and the over and under policing of racialized and minoritized communities are now embedded across the curriculum, not just confined to a single class or one course. I should add that fundamental to critical pedagogy, however, is the recognition that learners are free to accept or reject these ideas. To do so otherwise would simply replicate the banking model of education that critical pedagogy seeks to dismantle. Students are regularly reminded that they retain agency to engage with, question, or reject the theories presented in whole or in part. So to conclude, our continuing challenge as a Police Foundations program is to strike the right balance between training and education, one that prepares students not just for competent policing, but for conscientious policing. Thank you.
Great. So much thanks again, Professor Hayes, for all the work that you've done and your contributions to the policing education and training system that we currently have. So let's go immediately to a roundtable in relation to any questions any of our participants have here today, to be able to see exactly what we can hash out of this particular conversation. And just a quick comment here from Mike Federico. Thank you for all your continued contribution to policing excellence through your research and knowledge. So thanks so much there, Professor Hayes.
Well, thank you.
Yes. All right. By way of further context, the Coalition of Center for Policing Excellence for today's discussion. And Mike, are you online here? I don't see your name here.
Yes, I am, Neil. Thank you.
Oh, great. Great. I'll let you go right ahead, please. And you can perhaps take this a little bit further.
Well, okay. Thank you for the opportunity. It is an opportunity for the coalition today to put in context our initiative. As Dave mentioned at the start, we do make a distinction between training and education. And the coalition's focus is on educating people who intend to enter policing. The benefits of that are, I think, pretty well understood by the panels here, but it might be worth repeating. In our opinion, education not only informs the student about their community in preparation for policing the community, if they choose a career in policing, but it also prepares them for the necessary training they're about to receive. And with great deference to the three speakers, you each talk about an aspect of training that's vital to a police officer being a functional operative. And Greg, you talk about the ability to actually apply force responsibly as an example. But education prepares the student to learn why that's important. And if they understand why that's important, they'll be more receptive. I believe, as does I think the coalition generally, and I believe research backs it up, that an informed student will be a better trainee because they'll appreciate why they're being trained. And then it'll be encultured in them. This is just but one example of the distinction that the coalition draws between education and training. And of course, what the coalition is advancing is a national center that would research and recommend curricula to be delivered by the learning institutions across Canada, but do it in a way that respects the investments that have already been made in provinces, territories, and Indigenous communities, and use existing learning institutions, Professor Hayes, for example, your own university, to deliver the content, but in a way that unifies the knowledge and the expectations of those entering policing, so that, Inspector Wong, you receive an applicant who knows what's required and what's expected of a police officer in Canada, regardless of where they come from or what institution they graduated from. So, Chief DeBoard, thank you for the commercial interruption, and I'll let you get back to your regularly scheduled programming. Thank you all.
No, that's excellent. Thank you. And I know that you're stepping into an important role for the coalition. So thank you for your contributions to this. You know, I always used to say that we're all given firearms as police officers, and we build the skill to know how to shoot them well, but it takes wisdom to know when to shoot them. And that wisdom comes from education and experience we gather from the maturity process that you can get through education rather than training. The training teaches us how to shoot it accurately. The wisdom that we learn comes from the education. Other comments from others on who are participating here today?
I'll add a thought here. You know, one of the ongoing challenges that I have heard is that we provide a lot of training and opportunities for growth for our employees, but there's still a responsibility on the individual employee to come prepared and ready to learn and then implement that learning in the environment. And sometimes it doesn't translate that much. So as good as the training can be, it still depends on the individual to actually employ that learning.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's, you know, you have to become, when the student is ready, they'll learn, right? Properly. Yeah, absolutely. In relation to, I'd be interested in hearing other comments about how police training is often changed rather than sticking with a strict curriculum around the basic competencies that should be learned. But we change that according to the needs that are required throughout that particular staffing challenge. So if you need to put through 100 recruits into a class, sometimes you change the curriculum to be able to reflect that rather than sticking with either extending the class or making sure that you've hit all the competencies. I'd love to hear any opinion on that. Or no opinion.
I have an opinion on just about everything, Neil. So I'm not shy to express my opinion on that. Of course, you know, the real life challenges of getting officers on the street. You know, I speak to chiefs across Ontario. There's one, I don't have permission to use his name, but he's like, Greg, I would hire 28 officers tomorrow morning if I could find them. I'm just not getting candidates that I feel comfortable putting in uniform out on the streets in my city. So you know, there's in Ontario, at least, there's a huge issue with just simple staffing. We're short thousands of police officers across the province. So the pressure is on the police college to churn somebody in a uniform out after 12 weeks and get them back to their home service, which is not obviously an ideal circumstance, you know, which is why I'm advocating, you know, a 4-year degree program. In addition to not being just able to teach everything I would ever want to, Inspector Wong would ever want to, Professor Hayes would ever want to, but there would be a vetting built into 4 years. As a professor, if I have a student for 4 years, I'm going to know which ones are going to be good cops, which ones I should maybe have office hours with and say, you know, paramedic is a pretty good job too, you know, or if you're not afraid of heights, firefighting is even better and you make the same money and get to, oh, we won't go down that road, but you get my point. You know, I think that the pressure must be enormous on the police institutions trying to get somebody suitable out the door after a compressed period of time. And I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely. And I have two people. So I have Dr. Anderson first, then I'm going to turn it over to Cal Corley.
Greg, I really support your initiative to have a 4-year program because I taught for 38 years at the University of the Fraser Valley, where we had a 4-year program after the first 10 years. We moved from a 2-year to a 4-year program. And we were able to first of all, ask everyone who did the hiring in British Columbia, what is it that you want our graduates to be able to do and to know? And we got them together in Vancouver in one room, and with flip charts, we spent a whole day with them. They told us what they wanted as graduates. And so we built a curriculum around that. And then every 5 years, those same people sat on our advisory committee and advised us about how to tweak the curriculum so that it continued to meet their needs. I supervised 6,000 students over a period of 38 years in their field practice assignments, where they had to demonstrate the skills and knowledge that they accumulated during our program. And some people just couldn't cut it. We had to fail them, and they moved over into the general studies program. That was only about 10% because we screened and selected all of the students who came into the program. That made a real difference in terms of our confidence in placing students in jails, in police agencies where they had to do projects and they had to produce documents that proved they could write and think clearly. And I just think that 4-year model is a way to go. I'm just totally agreeing with you. It works. We know it works because we tracked what happens to students afterwards, and the province tracked them as well. They had more job satisfaction, that their education connected to their actual performance on the job, and that they got promoted twice as often as graduates from other universities in British Columbia. So we know that it works. And I just really want to support the whole idea about combining education with competency-based training, which we had courses for in writing, in interpersonal communication, problem solving, and leadership. So that works. We know it works. But right now, the problem that you said, Greg, is happening at the University of the Fraser Valley. Those courses don't exist there anymore because some academics came in and took over, and they didn't understand what they didn't understand. They didn't understand the need for competence. It's not their fault. They just are teaching theories and they're doing a great job, but they're not preparing people who are ready for the street.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. I'm going to go over to Cal Corley and then over to Mike Federico.
Oh, there's so much one could say here. I'm just going to focus on a couple of things. Just a couple of quick end notes first. Greg, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of that view from the Ivy Towers of Academe. And if any of you haven't ever read it, but you're interested in a really short piece on a view from inside those ivory towers, it's David Bailey's piece, Et tu, Brutus, which is a short piece, but he's very critical of his colleagues within academe. Anyways, if anybody wants it, I've got it on PDF and I have to share it.
I make all my students read that article, actually, Cal. And I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Bailey when I did my Fulbright at the University of Albany. Wonderful man.
Yeah, we've lost a great one a few years ago with him for sure. I couldn't agree more in terms of a university program as has been discussed. Hopefully we'll come back on that. But Kelly, I wanted to just pick up on something you touched on as the first point I want to make, and I'll cede the floor. You talked about candidates coming in on courses and not often taking ownership for their own learning. And there's 2 points I want to make on that. And one of them is about a culture of entitlement, which exists in policing. And I don't think it's one we can ignore. And I'll give a couple of examples, but there's a sense within policing that if I'm going to be trained something, the organization owes it to me to provide the learning. And for example, when I headed up the Canadian Police College, and this goes back when this first happened, was about 2010, and we had one of the major police services in Canada. The association came in with a representative from the organization. They wanted to do an audit of one of the particular courses, one of the longer ones. And what came out of that was every member from that police service that goes to the Canadian Police College on that course gets paid overtime for their pre-reading and for any reading they have to do during the course. And they've predetermined how many hours that is. So when they come in on that course, in that particular case, each member of their service gets 38 hours overtime, a time and a half to learn. And there's something fundamentally wrong with that. When we think about nurses, other professions where they've got to go out on their own time and maintain those certifications. That's point number one. The second point is in relation to a rapidly evolving external environment that we're operating in. And I go through the number of, different authors, peer-reviewed authors that are, talking about the changes taking place in the landscape of policing, where the future is going to be much more based on partnerships with others, et cetera, et cetera. And I link back to when Mr. Justice Frank Iacobucci wrote his piece after the Sammy Yatim shooting in Toronto. And chapter 5 of that, I think it is about police culture. And he acknowledges right at the front end of his 680-page thesis on that looking at culture wasn't part of his mandate, but he couldn't help look at it. There's two really important insights in that chapter. One was that the men and women at the front line and the first level of supervision in the TPS, and this applies to every police service in Canada largely, see their roles, and I'm just going to use the vernacular, they see their roles as warriors. And all this guardian stuff, the social side of policing, they don't know where that came from, but they think it's something new. Well, I can tell you, I just finished reading Marquis' book on the history of policing in Canada in the 20th century. So going back to 1905, and these were issues, the social side of policing, going back to the 1910s. So this is nothing new. And those of us who've been around policing a long time can attest to that. But what Iacobucci went on to say is that here's their worldview. Here's the reality. The challenge for police educators and trainers is that with those hardened worldviews, what he said is, if it's black and if it's tactical, paint it black, they'll be all over it. They'll suck up that training like crazy. But if you're trying to change behavior consistent with a worldview that's all that differs from theirs, he basically says you really got to think about how you're going to go about that, because it's going to be extraordinarily difficult. And I'll just leave it at that. But Kelly, I just thought I really enjoyed what you had to say, and I just wanted to pick up with those two observations. Thank you.
Great comments, Cal. Now we have two more speakers. We have Linda and we have Mike Federico. Then I'll turn it back to Dave Castles. Mike, I'm going to let you conclude, if you don't mind. I'm going to go to Linda first. And just to pick up on your point, Cal, there is now a course that I was part of called Use of Force for the Mind, and they changed it to Use of Force for the Mind just so they could get people interested if they put Use of Force in front of it. Great. Linda, over to you.
Thanks. Just a couple comments that connect to what people were saying. I'll start with what Cal just said, because that's the most recent. So I was a police officer for 24 years, and I taught at the Ontario Police College for 9 years, and I now do some work with police service boards. And I've developed a course, and we do it with police service boards, about understanding police culture, because if you're a board, you should understand who you're governing. But I do believe that it's something that needs to be integrated with, if it's not, I know it isn't here, with recruits and police training. You have to have an understanding of that culture, and not just kind of the talking about it, but the realities of it. And then to the point so I can say from the Ontario Police College perspective, and here's one of the frustrating things, is that this need for police, we need more people, and you're absolutely right. They're pushing them through. It's only 12 weeks. So you're correct. I forget who said that. I think it was Greg. It is only 12 weeks, which is definitely not enough, as they keep adding stuff. But we have this, what I find frustrating is this, we're forgetting about the quality of the training. About 4 or 5 years ago, we had a staff meeting, and the administration was so excited to say, oh, we're going to have, 400 recruits this intake. We're going to have 500 recruits this intake. And they were very excited about that. And I'm thinking, I don't like this because we've gone from a class with 30 students to 50 students, and you can't properly manage or know how many are getting it and not getting it. So I think it's a real challenge for us, for policing, to look at that and say, yes, first of all, change the mindset. We need more training, but we need quality training. And so I think all these pieces really fit in with what we're saying. Kelly, I love the approach and everything that you did. I think that's fantastic. Those are my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thanks, Linda. All right, Mike, you get to take us home, and I'll turn it back to Dave.
Thanks, Chief. Well, just I guess a repeat of a comment, but picking up on what Cal, Reagan, and Linda have said. In anticipation of a receptive student, we need to make the investments to prepare them to be trained so that it overcomes any negative aspects of police culture that might inhibit learning on the job. We've all seen our students during training cross their arms. We know exactly what that means. They personally don't believe they need to be there. They don't believe they're the subject of the training that the training is designed to address, because they don't believe that they behave in the way that the training wants to address, or they have the attitudes that the training wants to address. But a deeper education that's been discussed by the speakers here today will help prepare the student to appreciate how important that training is. But secondly, I hate to be, kind of the bearer of a caution, but right now, the studies that look into whether or not a university, I'll use that word kind of just informally, university educated student will be a better police officer, or first of all, spare. There are not many studies. And secondly, many of them are inconclusive. We have the Police Executive Research Foundation in the United States has opined that an education alone is not going to make a good police officer. Hence the point today, it's a combination. But there are some recent trends across Canada, Linda, particularly in response to the pressure to recruit, to actually eliminate education as a student requirement or attribute, because we just need to fill the spaces. So, the coalition is working to create this appreciation, understanding, dare I say, Dave, movement to invest in education. But we have to be alive to the realities that there are these countervailing pressures to move people through the application process as quickly as possible just to fill boots. Now, I'm going to suggest, though, that that's not unlike so many other institutional positions, from medicine to science generally, engineering. So policing isn't different in that regard, I would submit. But it does require us to start to become a bit more vocal and maybe advocates, lobbyists for a creation of an education program for people who intend to go into policing. And once again, I'll get off my soapbox. Thanks.
Wonderful. Over to you, Dave.
Well, first of all, Neil, thank you very much. You bring wisdom and experience to this experience today. Cal, for your comments, and of course our 3 speakers. I truly appreciate it. I just want to say that people still, in my personal opinion, including some police leaders and others, haven't come to grips with the potential of a National Center of Policing Excellence. Not bricks and mortar, but an organization that will do all of the research, evidence-based curriculum, course development and curriculum that's current and relevant, available to educational institutions, to begin to prepare police people for the policing function. They bring the knowledge that you've talked about today, and I don't think that I could have made a stronger point of the potential of a national center that would not cost that much for the federal government to create and the provinces to cooperate with, as is clear in a constitutional legal analysis that we have. I only want to say thank you to everybody, and please consider the National Center and how you might be able to contribute to seeing that come to fruition.